This is probably the creepiest, most unexplainable thing that has ever happened to me. I used to work overnight as a security guard at the local port. The site itself was massive, nearly 2 miles in radius, but at night, it was empty. The only people there were me, 2 other guards, and the safety official. Most nights, we were stationed at the front gate, the main entrance, because there was no activity anywhere else. The veteran guards would always say the port was haunted, that years ago, workers had died in freak accidents, and that some of them never really left. I believed in angels and demons, but I always assumed the old-timers were just messing with the new guys. For the first few weeks, I didn't see or hear anything unusual, just the occasional creaks and some misplaced objects during my patrol rounds, nothing that couldn't be explained. But then, that night happened. The port had an old gym, built for workers who had to stay overnight during big projects. Inside, there was a sauna, weights, and a racquetball court. A small enclosed space with thin plaster walls and thick glass doors. On our nightly patrols, me and another guard, Mike, would stop by the gym to play a few rounds of racquetball before heading back to the front gate. But that night, around 2:30 a.m., we decided to hit a full workout instead. The gym was silent, so quiet that you could hear the electricity humming through the lights. The air conditioner was off. Everything was off. The only thing running were the overhead lights. Then, about 15 to 20 minutes in, we heard it. A loud thump. We both froze, then brushed it off as nothing. Maybe something shifting, maybe the building settling. But then it happened again, even louder this time. At first, we thought it might be our lieutenant walking around. We radioed him. "I'm at the front gate." His voice came through calm and clear. We exchanged glances. If it wasn't him, then who? The thumps continued, coming from the racquetball court on the other side of the gym. One after another, rhythmic, constant. We tried thinking logically. The air conditioner? No, it was off. Even when it was on during the day, it never made a sound like that. Then, the thumps sped up, like something was pounding the wall. We had to see for ourselves. As we walked toward the court, every step felt heavier. The hallway was cold, colder than it should have been. We reached the glass door. I flicked on my flashlight, and that's when I felt it. Every hair on my body standing on end. My stomach dropped. My eyes started to tear up, not from sadness, but from sheer, overwhelming terror. Inside the court, a single racquetball was rolling slowly across the floor, but there was no one there. The realization hit us like a freight train. The thumps we heard were from the balls being slammed against the walls. Something, or someone, had been playing inside that court. We didn't stick around to find out what. Without a word, we turned and sprinted full speed back to the front gate. Our hearts were pounding, our legs burning, but we didn't stop until we reached safety. The lieutenant saw us and immediately knew something was wrong and asked, "What the hell happened? Why are you running like that?" Out of breath, we told him everything. His face darkened, and then he said something that chilled me even more than what we'd just seen. "That's why guards quit all the time. There's something evil in that area. And this isn't the first time it's happened." Then he pulled up the security footage. On the screen, we saw shadows, dark figures, moving through the office areas. Lights flickering on and off. My stomach twisted. I had never had a real encounter with the supernatural before that night. Some say it was a demonic presence, messing with us. Others believe it was the spirit of a worker who died there long ago. I don't know what it was, but after that night, I didn't last long at the job. And even as I type this, I feel it again. That same cold, creeping dread from that night. There were other experiences too, but I'll save those for later. I used to work the night shift at St. Mary's Hospital in Chicago. I was a nurse in the ICU, and my shifts ran from 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. It was exhausting, but I didn't mind. The hospital was always busy, and I liked the quiet of the early morning when most of the world was asleep. But one night, I saw something I can't explain. It was a Tuesday night, and the hospital was unusually quiet. The ICU had fewer patients than usual, and most of my co-workers were in the break room, sipping coffee and chatting softly. I stayed behind at the nurses' station, catching up on paperwork. The security monitors were to my left, displaying live feeds from the hallways and patient rooms. I glanced at them absent-mindedly as I scribbled notes. That's when I saw her. A woman in a hospital gown stood outside room 306, her back hunched, arms hanging limp at her sides. She wasn't moving, just standing there, her head tilted slightly, like she was listening for something. My stomach dropped. Room 306 was empty. I checked the admission logs. No one had been assigned to that room for days. It had been cleaned, sanitized, and locked. I swallowed hard, telling myself it was just a mistake, maybe a patient who wandered out of bed. That wasn't uncommon in the ICU. Some patients, especially those under heavy medication, sleepwalked or became disoriented at night. I grabbed my flashlight and got up. The hallway was eerily quiet, the overhead lights dimmed to a dull yellow glow. My footsteps echoed in the silence as I walked toward room 306. I turned the corners, but she was gone. The hallway was completely empty. A cold chill ran down my spine, but I forced myself to check inside the room. The bed was neatly made, the machines unplugged, the air stale, as if no one had entered in weeks. But something felt off. I could still feel a presence, a faint, almost electric charge in the air, like someone was watching me. Then I heard it, a faint, shuffling sound. Not from the hallway, but from inside the room. I turned, my flashlight flickering. My hands shook as I checked under the bed, behind the curtain, inside the small bathroom, but nothing. I let out a breath and stepped back into the hallway, shaking my head. I was just tired. My mind was playing tricks on me. But then I noticed something on the security monitor back at the station. A few minutes earlier, as I was entering room 306, the woman had turned her head. She had looked directly at the camera, and she was smiling. I slammed the laptop shut, my heart pounding in my chest. I took a deep breath, trying to shake off the growing unease. Maybe it was a glitch, a trick of the light. Maybe I was just exhausted. The next morning, I told myself I had imagined the whole thing. Maybe the screen had glitched. Maybe it was just a reflection or a trick of the light. But that night, when I came in for my shift, I found a patient file sitting on my desk. It was old, the paper slightly yellowed, and the name on it made my blood run cold. Eleanor Carter, the woman who had died in room 306. She had been in a coma for months, unresponsive, trapped in a body that refused to wake up. But one night, the nurses on duty heard shuffling feet coming from her room. When they checked, she was still in bed, hooked to the machines. An hour later, she died. Ever since then, the night shift workers had seen strange things. A figure standing at the end of the hall, a patient bell ringing even though the room was empty, a woman staring into the windows of empty rooms. My skin crawled as I put the file away. I decided I was done investigating. If I ignored it, maybe it would leave me alone. But that night, as I lay in bed, my eyes heavy from exhaustion, I felt a shift in the air, a cold, suffocating pressure, and then a whisper, soft, slow, like breath against my ear.
You saw me.
I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. My eyes shot open, and in the darkness of my room, I saw something in the corner. A figure, standing completely still. I wanted to scream, but my throat was locked. My body was paralyzed, frozen in place. The shadow took a step forward. It moved closer. until it was right beside me. And then, in that same slow, whispering voice,
Now, I see you too.
and everything blacked out. When I woke up, it was morning. My room was empty. The air was warm again. I tried to tell myself it was just a nightmare, but something told me otherwise. Because when I got up, my bedside lamp was on the floor, and my window had been unlocked. A wave of cold fear washed over me. I stared at the latch, my breath catching in my throat. I knew for a fact that I had locked it before going to bed. Someone, or something, had been in my room. By morning, I had made my decision, and that was the last time I worked night shifts. I transferred to day duty the next week. I never told anyone what happened. I didn't want to know more. But I still have dreams about that night. And sometimes, when I walk past an empty hospital room, I feel the urge to look inside. But I never do, because sometimes they look back. I've had sleep paralysis before. It always starts the same way. I wake up in the middle of the night, completely unable to move. My mind is awake, but my body is frozen. Usually, it lasts for a few seconds, maybe a minute, and then I snap out of it. But this time, it was different. This happened about a year ago when I was traveling for work. My company had sent me to a small town in Oregon to inspect some properties for a project. Since it was a last-minute trip, all the hotels were fully booked, so I had to settle for an Airbnb, a small old house on the outskirts of town. The moment I stepped inside, something felt off. The air was stale, like the windows hadn't been opened in years. The walls were covered in old wallpaper, peeling at the edges. There were no family photos, no decorations, just empty shelves and a large antique mirror facing the bed. I told myself I was overthinking things. I was tired from the long drive and just needed to sleep. The first night passed without incident, but on the second night, I woke up paralyzed. It started with an unbearable pressure on my chest. I couldn't move. I couldn't even blink. It felt like something was sitting on top of me, pressing down, making it impossible to breathe. Then I felt it. A presence. Something was in the room with me. Slowly, my eyes adjusted to the darkness. My heart pounded so hard it echoed in my ears. And then, I saw it. A shadowy figure stood at the foot of my bed. It was tall, unnaturally tall. Its head nearly touched the ceiling, and its body was just a mass of shifting darkness. It had no eyes, but I could feel it staring at me. Then, it moved. It didn't walk. It glided, closer and closer. The pressure on my chest grew worse. My breathing became ragged and shallow. My limbs wouldn't respond. I tried to scream, but my throat was locked. It leaned over me now, its faceless head tilting unnaturally to the side, like it was examining me. Then, in a voice like a whispering storm, it spoke. "You let me in." A sharp, burning pain shot through my body, as if something had clawed into my skin. And then, just as suddenly as it started, I could move again. I shot up, gasping, drenched in sweat. My heart was hammering in my chest. The room was silent. The shadow was gone. I wanted to believe it was just a nightmare, just another case of sleep paralysis. But then I noticed something that made my stomach drop. My phone was lying on the floor. The screen was cracked, and when I picked it up, the camera app was open. A photo had been taken at 3:03 a.m. It was dark, blurry. But in the reflection of the mirror across from my bed, I saw it. A tall, shadowy figure standing over me, watching me. I checked out of that Airbnb the next morning. The owner didn't ask any questions, just refunded me without hesitation, as if they already knew. But it didn't end there. Ever since that night, the sleep paralysis has been happening more often. At first, it was once a month, then once a week. Now, nearly every night. And every time, I wake up to that same feeling, that same presence, standing at the foot of my bed and watching me. I work as a behavioral health technician at what's considered a luxury drug and alcohol rehab facility. But to me, it feels more like a mansion with secrets. The building itself is massive. 3 stories, 13 rooms, each with private bathrooms and jacuzzi tubs. There's a gym, 3 living rooms, a ballroom turned yoga studio, a commercial kitchen, a doctor's office, a sprawling garden, and even an elevator. On the outside, it looks like a mix between the bank's Bel Air mansion from Fresh Prince and a mini White House. It's grand, elegant, but something about it feels off. I started working there back in September, and during my first week, 2 clients casually mentioned that the place was haunted. I laughed it off. Every old building has ghost stories, right? Then I started my 11 p.m. to 7:30 a.m. shift. By the time I clock in, the house is silent. The clients are asleep, and it's just me and the night nurse. With all that space, all that emptiness, it's easy for your mind to play tricks on you. But sometimes, the tricks feel a little too real. My office is on the 2nd floor, while the nurse's office, the kitchen, and the massive pantry are on the 1st. The pantry is always locked. Only the nurse has the key. A couple of weeks ago, I was sitting in my office when I suddenly heard stomping, fast, heavy footsteps coming up the stairs. The nurse bursts in, her face twisted in anger, and said, "Why were you in the pantry scaring me?" I just stare at her, confused, and said, "What are you talking about?" "I've been sitting here this whole time." The color drains from her face, and she said, "You weren't just in the pantry? You didn't knock and say, 'Knock, knock'?" I shake my head. "How could I? You have the only key." Her eyes widen. She doesn't say another word, just turns around and walks out. 10 minutes later, I hear her muttering, and when I go downstairs to check what is happening, I find her in her office, on her knees, praying in Punjabi. I just got confused and just leave. At 6 a.m., the chef and handyman clock in. They ask how our night was, and I jokingly say, "Casper scared Nurse J in the pantry." But the chef doesn't even look surprised. Instead, he said, "Oh, that's Kay. If it was in the pantry, it's definitely Kay." I freeze. "What do you mean? Who's Kay?" He shrugs. "I've worked here for 15 years. This place used to be a retirement home. Lots of people passed away here. Some of them never really left." He starts listing off names, places they've been seen. Kay is just one of many. "They've always been friendly," he adds. "Not the malicious kind of hauntings." I glance at Nurse J. She's quiet, still shaken. 2 weeks later, she quits. Since then, I've heard footsteps when I know I'm alone. Lights flicker. Fireplaces turn on by themselves, but I haven't heard anyone whisper my name. Not yet. And honestly, my paycheck is way higher than it should be. My supervisor says it's because they can't keep the night shift staffed. I think it's because this place is haunted, and my pay is just high enough to keep me from running. Growing up, I lived in a house that felt isolated from the rest of the world, surrounded by dense woods that stretched endlessly in all directions. The towering trees cast long, shifting shadows, and the wind whispered through the leaves like hushed voices carrying secrets. Our nearest neighbors were far enough away that if something happened in our home, no one would hear. At first glance, the house seemed ordinary, just another aging structure with creaky floors and drafty windows. But as I got older, I started noticing things that didn't quite make sense. Sometimes I'd hear faint rustling sounds when no one else was around, or catch movement out of the corner of my eye, only for it to disappear when I turned my head. My parents always dismissed it by saying, "It's just the house settling. You have an active imagination." Maybe they were right. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. At least, that's what I told myself. Until the footsteps started. It always happened around midnight. Some nights, as I lay in bed struggling to fall asleep, an uneasy feeling would creep over me, as if unseen eyes were watching from the shadows. The air felt heavy and pressing down on my chest. Then came the footsteps. Soft and deliberate steps echoed above my head, coming from the attic. Slow and pacing, as if someone was up there, waiting for something. At first, I brushed it off as my mind playing tricks on me, but then I heard it. Something shifting in my closet. A soft thud, like an object falling. My body froze, and my breath hitched in my throat. I wanted to believe it was nothing, but the overwhelming dread wrapping around me told me otherwise. Gathering all my courage, I slipped out of bed and tiptoed into the hallway. The house was still. My parents' door was shut, and my siblings sound asleep in their rooms. There was no way anyone had been in the attic. My mind screamed at me to go back to bed, but my heart was hammering and warning me that something was terribly wrong. I forced myself back into my room and shut the door. I climbed into bed, pulling the blanket up to my chin. Then, the footsteps returned even louder this time. My pulses racing, and then a loud crash from my closet. I bolted out of my bed and ran straight to my parents' room, gasping for breath. I burst through the door, my hands shaking as I reached for my mom's shoulder, shaking her awake. My words tumbled out in a frantic, barely coherent rush. My dad groaned, rubbing his eyes as he listened. They exchanged glances, their expressions groggy and unconvinced. "It's probably just your imagination," my mom murmured sleepily. But I knew what I heard. I knew what I felt. Reluctantly, they followed me back to my bedroom. My dad flicked on the light, and as soon as they stepped inside, their doubt wavered. The closet door was slightly ajar, its darkness yawning open like a mouth. On the floor, pieces of a board game lay scattered. It had been sitting on the highest shelf, pushed way back. There was no way it could have fallen on its own. My dad sighed and helped me pick up the pieces. My mom patted my back and said, "See? Nothing to be afraid of." They tucked me back in and left the room. The moment their footsteps faded down the hallway, the silence in my room grew unbearable. I strained my ears, listening. Every sound, the ticking clock, the rustling leaves outside, felt magnified. Then, the whispering began. Now, it whispering my name.
Sophia.
So soft, so close. I gripped my blanket tighter, my body stiff with terror. My eyes darted around the room, searching the darkness. My breathing was shallow, every inhale sharp and ragged. Then, from the corner of my vision, I saw it. A shadow moved across my wall, right beside my closet. It wasn't just a flicker or a trick of the light. It was the shape of a person. I didn't wait. My limbs moved before my mind could catch up. I snatched my pillow and blanket and bolted out of the room, barely registering my feet hitting the floor as I ran straight back to my parents' bedroom. My hands trembled as I curled up on the floor, heart racing so fast I thought it might stop altogether. After that day, I slept there for days, too afraid to go back. Eventually, I forced myself to return to my bedroom, but the footsteps never stopped. Some nights, when the house was quiet and the world outside was swallowed by darkness, I would still hear them, slow and pacing. We moved out not long after. To this day, I still don't know what was up there. I don't know what whispered my name, but I do know one thing. Something was in that house, and it knew I was there.